When the Captor Loves the Captive. A dramatic narrative narrated in the first person by Mila Fontaine. Part 1, The Park. I saw him kill someone on a Tuesday. I want to say this plainly because the plainness of it is the thing that has stayed with me most. Not the violence itself, which was terrible, but the plainness of it. The specific ordinariness of the moment before. I had been working late, as I almost always was working late in those months, and I was walking home through the Parc de la Jarente, which is a shortcut I took every evening, despite the fact that everyone who knew about it told me not to. My parents had told me not to take that route. My colleague from the third floor, whose name was Dominique, and who knew the neighborhood better than I did, had told me not to take it. I had told all of them the same thing, which was that nothing ever happened to me, which was the kind of statement that people make about themselves until the moment it becomes false, at which point they are no longer in a position to comment on it. My name is Mila Fontaine. I am 26 years old. I grew up in the 14th arrondissement of Paris in an apartment above a bakery that my parents have run for 30 years, and I smell of bread in a way that has been with me so long I no longer notice it, but that other people sometimes mention. I studied graphic design at the École Nationale Supérieure des Arts Décoratifs, which is the school I attended partly because I was genuinely good at visual thinking, and partly because I wanted to be somewhere that was not the bakery. Not because I did not love my parents, because I needed to know who I was when I was not their daughter. After school, I had worked for 3 years at a small design agency in the Marais district, doing the kind of work that was interesting enough to justify the hours, but not interesting enough to justify telling people about at dinner parties. I was not unhappy. I was not particularly happy. I was in the specific medium state of a person who has achieved what they set out to achieve, and is still in the process of understanding whether it was the right thing to set out for. On that Tuesday evening in October, I was walking home through the Parc de la Jarente at 20 past 11. It was not cold yet, but it was cool, and the park was empty in the way of urban parks. At that hour, the specific absence of everyone who belongs somewhere else. The path through the middle of the park was lit by a line of old iron lamps that cast yellow circles on the gravel. I saw 2 men on the far side of the park near the wall. One was sitting against the wall. The other was standing over him. I did not process this correctly at first. My brain offered me the most available interpretation: 2 friends, one sitting and one standing, having a conversation in a park at 11 at night. This interpretation was almost immediately contradicted by the quality of the movement, which was wrong in a way I could not immediately name, but that the body understood before the mind did. The standing man moved. There was a knife. The sitting man became very still very quickly. The standing man straightened. He turned. He looked directly at me. I have thought about that look many times since, the specific quality of it. Not threatening, not alarmed, not calculating. Something more fundamental than any of those. The look of a person encountering an unexpected element in a situation they had planned carefully, and whose first response is simply to take in the full dimensions of the unexpected element before deciding anything. I ran. I did not get far. Part 2, The Stone House. When I woke up, I was in a room made of stone, not metaphorically. The walls were actual stone dark grey, fitted together with the precision of someone who had built this structure with the intention of it lasting. The ceiling was low, the single window was small, and set high in the wall, too high to reach and too small to fit through. The floor was stone also, with a rug that covered most of it, which I registered as an incongruous detail. The rug as though someone had made an effort toward comfort in a space that was fundamentally not designed for it. There was a bed, a narrow one with clean sheets, a small table with 2 chairs, a cooktop on a low counter, a door in the far wall that I understood, from the quality of the silence behind it, to be a bathroom. A second door, heavier, which was the way out and was obviously locked. On the table there were 2 cups, 2 plates, and a pot of something that was emitting steam. I stood beside the bed and looked at all of this for a long time, doing the specific mental work of assessing a situation for which I had no previous framework. The door opened. He was tall, dark hair pale for someone dark-haired with the specific pallor that comes not from illness, but from a life conducted mostly indoors or at night. He was perhaps 30, perhaps slightly older. The quality of his face was the most disconcerting thing about him. It was a face that was taken feature by feature actually quite good, long, dark eyes with a quality of attention that I would later learn never quite turned off. A sharp jaw. A mouth that was capable, I would also learn later, of expressions that bore almost no relation to the expressions I had first seen on it. At that moment, the expression was nothing, not blank exactly, present but withheld, the face of someone who has learned to give away only what they choose to give away. He said, "Your name is Mila Fontaine." His voice was lower than I expected. He spoke French with an accent that I could not immediately place something from a region rather than a foreign country. I said nothing. I was pressing my back against the wall beside the bed and doing the useless calculation that people do in situations they cannot escape, looking for the exit I already knew did not exist. He said, "My name is Lucien Moreau." He sat down at the table. He opened the pot. Inside was a soup, something with lentils and herbs that smelled, despite everything, like something a person would actually want to eat. He said, "I know you are frightened. I am going to tell you a few things that will be useful for you to know." He told me. He did it with the economy of someone who has thought about how to say something and has decided that the direct version is the most efficient. He told me he was a contracted assassin, that he had been since the age of 17, that the person I had seen him kill in the park had been a contracted target, and that he did not, as a rule, kill people outside of his contracts. He told me I had seen something that meant I could not simply be released, and that my choices were therefore limited. He told me the house was in the middle of a forest that was not navigable without specific knowledge of its paths. He told me that attempting to find my way out alone would almost certainly result in my death from exposure or from any number of other things the forest contained. He said, "I am not going to hurt you. That is not what this is." I said, "What is it then?" He said, "I am still deciding." He poured 2 bowls of soup. He pushed one toward the empty chair across from him. I did not sit down, but I looked at the soup. He said, without looking at me, "It is not drugged. I have no reason to drug you. You cannot go anywhere." He was right that I could not go anywhere. This was in the moment not reassuring. I sat down. I ate the soup, which was very good. This was the first of many things about Lucien Moreau that contradicted the available categories. Part 3, the forest. The forest he had described was real. I saw it every day through the high, small window of the stone house. The specific density of European old-growth forest, oak and beech and ash. The canopy so complete that the light came through filtered and green, the floor below dark, and layered with years of accumulated leaf matter. In the mornings, fog sat in the lower sections of the forest until mid-morning. In the evenings, the light changed rapidly and completely, moving from gold to grey to dark within 20 minutes. Lucien called it the Forêt de Murmures. I did not know if this was its actual name or one he had given it. He moved through it with a fluency that I watched from the window, the specific movement of someone who knows a landscape at the level of the body, who does not think about where to step, but simply knows. He came and went without pattern, sometimes gone for hours, sometimes absent for what felt like days. When he was there, we occupied the stone house together in a way that I could not find the correct word for. Coexistence is too neutral. Captivity is accurate but incomplete. The dynamic between us defied the framework I had available for it because it kept producing elements that the framework did not include. He cooked every meal with a focused precision that I associated incoherently with people who find cooking meditative. He was not a person who appeared to need meditation. He appeared to need very little, to have reduced his requirements to a kind of minimum, that was not asceticism, but efficiency. And yet he cooked carefully with attention to detail, and the food was always good. He had books, a large quantity of them, filling 2 shelves that ran the length of the north wall of the main room. They were organized not by author or title, but as far as I could tell, by something more personal, by some organizing principle I could not decode from the outside. I read the spines, sometimes trying to understand the system. He had a laptop that he used at certain times of day positioned so that I could not see the screen. He had a satellite phone that he kept on his person and answered twice in my presence, with the specific shorthand of someone conducting professional business in code. After these calls, the quality of his stillness changed. He became the version of himself that I found most difficult to look at directly, the version that had done what he had done in the park, and would do it again for someone who had paid for it. I tried to escape 4 times. The first time was on the 3rd day. I found a window latch that was less secure than the others, and worked it open and dropped into the undergrowth outside, and ran for what felt like 20 minutes into the trees, before I understood that I was running in a direction that offered no variation, no road, no clearing, no indication of human habitation. The forest continued in every direction with the specific mercilessness of a natural system that has no interest in human urgency. I stopped running because I had to stop. I leaned against a tree and breathed, and understood that I did not know where I was or which direction led anywhere, and that the practical consequence of this understanding was that I had to go back. Lucien was at the table when I came back in reading. He looked up. He said nothing about the escape attempt. He said dinner in an hour. I sat on the bed and shook for a while from the adrenaline and the cold, and the specific quality of terror that is not the terror of an immediate threat, but the terror of a situation that continues. The 2nd, 3rd, and 4th escape attempts produced similar results. I went further each time, having tried to learn the forest by noting landmarks. On the 4th attempt, I was genuinely lost for several hours in a state of cold panic. That was the most frightening experience of my captivity, more frightening than the initial kidnapping, because the threat was not a person but a landscape. Lucien found me. He did not explain how. He appeared from the trees with a flashlight and a jacket, and walked me back to the house in silence. He gave me hot tea and did not speak for an hour, and when he finally spoke, he said only, "There is a path that leads out. It takes 4 hours to walk. Without knowing exactly where it is, you will not find it." I said, "Will you show me?" He said, "No." I said, "Then I will keep trying." He looked at me for a moment. He said, "I know." He did not say this as a threat. He said it with the specific quality of someone acknowledging a fact that they have no intention of preventing. Part 4, who he was. I learned about Lucien in pieces, not because he was confessional. He was one of the least confessional people I had ever encountered, operating with an economy of self-disclosure that I initially experienced as hostility and later understood as habit. He had, for reasons that became clear only gradually, structured his entire existence around revealing as little as possible. The habit had become so ingrained that I do not think he always knew he was doing it. What I learned came from observation and from the occasional statement that escaped the economy. Observations accumulated over weeks into an understanding that was more accurate than any direct account would have been, because direct accounts are always edited by the person giving them. And Lucien's editing was so complete that what slipped through the editing was the truest material. He had grown up in Lyon. I knew this from the regional quality of his accent, confirmed once when he mentioned a street in the Croix-Rousse district in the context of something else. He had grown up there without his parents. He did not say this directly. He said once that he had learned to cook from the woman who ran the group home where he had lived between the ages of 7 and 17. And the phrasing of group home, the casualness of it, told me more than he had intended. The organization that had recruited him at 17 had found him precisely because he was a specific kind of person alone in the world, capable of violence in the specific controlled way that certain people are capable of it when they have been given the right conditions, and without the attachments that make such a person difficult to manage. He had given them 10 years. He told me once in this process of leaving, not dramatically, not defecting, simply reaching the end of a contract with himself that he had decided not to renew. He had a sister, or someone he called a sister, the language of it, slightly ambiguous, the way the language of family is always slightly ambiguous for people who have assembled their families from available materials rather than blood. Her name was Vivienne. She worked in Bordeaux, something in the wine industry. She did not know what he did, or she did not know the details. He sent her money twice a year and received in return brief and cheerful letters that he read with the expression of someone handling something very fragile. I found one of these letters on the floor once fallen from the shelf. I picked it up without reading it and handed it back to him. He took it from me with the specific care of someone taking back something they did not intend to share, and folded it into his jacket pocket. He said, "She thinks I am a security consultant." I said, "Do you ever think about telling her the truth?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No." I said, "Why not?" He said, "Because it would change the way she sees me, and I prefer the way she sees me." I sat with this. I thought about what it means to have one person in the world who holds a clean version of you, a version you know is not entirely accurate, but that you cannot bring yourself to correct, because the correction would cost too much. I said, "Is she the reason you are leaving?" He said, "She is one of the reasons." He went back to whatever he had been doing. I looked at the space where he had been standing and thought about the specific loneliness of a person who has organized their entire existence round not needing anyone, and has spent years doing it successfully, and has recently begun to wonder whether the success was actually the problem. Part 7 continued the night of the storm. There was a storm in the 7th week that I want to tell you about, because it was the night that the situation between us shifted in a way that neither of us could afterward pretend had not happened. The storm came from the west in the late afternoon, moving through the forest with the specific violence of autumn weather that has been building for days, and has finally found the conditions to release itself. The sound of it in the trees was extraordinary, the kind of sound that makes you understand why people throughout history have attributed storms to intention, to anger, to something with a will behind it. The stone house was solid, and the stone house was old, and the stone house did not move, but the world outside the stone house moved continuously for 6 hours. I was afraid, not of the storm specifically, of the combination of the storm and the darkness and the enclosure, which together produced the specific panic that I had been managing with variable success since the beginning of my captivity. I was sitting on the bed with my knees drawn up and my back against the wall, doing the breathing exercise that Dominique from the office had taught me years ago for something entirely unrelated to this. Lucien came into the room. He did not ask if I was all right. He looked at me for a moment and then sat down on the floor beside the bed, his back against the wall below me, which put him between me and the door, and between me and the window. And he did not say anything. We sat like this for a long time. The storm did what storms do, enormous and indifferent. I breathed in the specific way that Dominique had taught me. After a while, the specific panic receded to a manageable level, and I became aware of him sitting below me on the floor, very still, not sleeping. Present in the specific way he was present when he had decided to be. I said, "You do not have to stay." He said, "I know." I said, "Why are you staying?" He said, "You were afraid." I said, "I am often afraid. You do not usually stay." He said, "I am staying now." We were quiet again. The storm. I said, "Lucien, can I ask you something?" He said, "Yes." I said, "When you decided to keep me here, was it entirely because I was a witness, or was there another reason?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that I thought he was not going to answer. He said, "In the beginning it was entirely because you were a witness. I had no good option, and I chose the option that kept the situation contained. I waited." He said, "After the first week it was more complicated than that." I said, "Tell me what was complicated." He said, "You were not what I expected." I said, what did you expect? He said someone who would be manageable. Someone who would accept the situation because the alternative was worse. Someone I would not have to think about as a person. I said, and instead? He said, instead you tried to escape 4 times, which was extremely inconvenient. You asked questions I had not been asked before. You argued with me about the bookshelves for 20 minutes. I almost smiled. I said, you still have not explained the bookshelf system. He said, no. I said, why not? He said, because it would require explaining things about myself that I have not explained to anyone. The storm moved over the forest. The rain on the stone roof was a continuous sound. I said, Lucian, the complicated thing? He said, yes. I said, I need you to say it. He was very quiet. Then he said, you became someone I did not want to lose. I am aware of how that sounds, given the context. I said, I know how it sounds. He said, I am not asking you to interpret it in any particular way. I am only telling you because you asked. I sat with this. The context was what it was. The context was 3 months of captivity in a stone house in a forest of unequal power, of a situation I had not chosen and could not leave. The context was not the context in which feelings ought to develop or in which feelings can be entirely trusted. And yet, I said, I know how it sounds, and I am not going to tell you it does not complicate things, because it does. But I want you to know that I see you, not the instrument, the person underneath. He said nothing. I said, whatever happens when I leave here, I want you to know that. The storm went on for 2 more hours. When it finally diminished and the forest returned to its ordinary night sounds, Lucian stood up from the floor and went back to the main room. I lay down on the narrow bed and looked at the stone ceiling and thought about what I had said, and whether I meant it, and concluded that I had meant it, which was the most complicated conclusion I had reached about anything in 3 months. Part 8 continued the morning after. The next morning he made breakfast without comment on the previous night. This was characteristic of him, the moving forward without backward reference, the refusal to create a fixed point out of something that was still in motion. I had come to find this quality both admirable and occasionally maddening. I sat at the table and drank my coffee and watched him at the cooktop, with the attention I had been paying to everything about him for 7 weeks. The specific economy of his movement, the way he moved in small spaces without displacing things, the way he was always, even in ordinary tasks, slightly more alert than the task required the alertness of someone who has survived by maintaining it. He put a plate in front of me, eggs, toasted bread, a small dish of jam he had made himself from some berry the forest contained which I had not asked about, and he had not explained, but which was better than any jam I had bought in Paris. He sat across from me. He looked at his coffee. He said, I have been thinking about what you said. I said, which part? He said that you see the person, not the instrument. I said, yes. He said, I want to ask you something that may not have a comfortable answer. I said, ask it. He said, do you believe that the person and the instrument can be separated? Or do you believe they are the same thing? I sat with this. It was the right question, the honest question, the one that the previous night's conversation had been building toward without quite arriving at. I said I think they were the same for a long time because the conditions made them the same. I think they are not entirely the same anymore. I think the person has been reasserting himself for some time. He said, how can you know that? I said, because of the books, because of the jam, because you sat on the floor during a storm without being asked. He looked at the table. He said, those are small things. I said, small things are how people are actually built, not by large gestures, by the small things that accumulate into a pattern. He looked up at me. His face did the thing it occasionally did. The thing I had no name for, the thing that was underneath the management. He said, I do not know how to be just the person. I have been the instrument for too long. I do not know what just the person does. I said, I think you are finding out. We ate breakfast. Outside the high window, the forest was the forest. In the post-storm morning, everything washed and bright and rearranged. Part 9, Vivienne. He called Vivienne during the 9th week. I know because I heard his side of it. which was more than he usually permitted me to hear. He did not move to the other room. He sat at the table and made the call and spoke to his sister with the specific quality he had for her, more open than he was with anyone else. Slightly warmer, the economy slightly relaxed. She asked about his work, and he said it was going well. She asked about his health, and he said he was fine. She told him about a vintage she was working with at the winery, something about the particular character of the grape this year, and he listened with the focused attention he gave to everything and asked a specific question about the fermentation process that surprised her. I could hear the surprise in the brief silence before her answer, because it suggested he had been paying attention to her work across many conversations and had retained the details. After a while, she asked if he was happy. He looked at me across the table. I was looking at him. Our eyes met. He said, "I think I might be learning how to be." She said something that made him make a sound that was almost a laugh. He said, "Yes," something like that. After he put the phone down, we sat in silence for a moment. Then I said, "She sounds good." He said, "She is. She has always been good. She was good even in the group home, which is a significant achievement." I said, "She loves you very much." He said, "She loves who she thinks I am." I said, "I think she loves who you are." People like Vivian, the ones who are good even in difficult conditions, they tend to see more clearly than other people. They do not have the luxury of the protective blur. He said, "The protective blur." I said, "The way most people soften their view of the people they love. Look away from what is difficult. Vivian cannot afford that. Everything she has had to love has required her to love it clearly." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "She knows more than she lets on. About the kind of work I do. Not the details, but the category of it. She has never asked me directly, which I think is her way of protecting me from having to lie to her. I said, or her way of loving you without making you smaller." He looked at me. I said, "Some people love you by accepting you as you are and not requiring you to justify it. That is not blindness, it is a choice." He said, "When did you become a philosopher?" I said I had a lot of time to think. He made a sound that was definitively this time a laugh, small and brief and real. It was the first time I had heard him laugh. I registered it with the specific attention I gave to the rare things. Part 10, Sandrine returns. A woman came to the house in the second month. Her name was Sandrine. She arrived in a car that Lucien met at the edge of the forest, which I watched from the high window, and she came into the house with the confident familiarity of someone who has been here before and knows she is welcome. She was perhaps 40, with the specific physical confidence of a person who has spent a long time making fast decisions in difficult situations. She moved through the house, quickly assessed everything including me with the same efficient scan, and sat down at the table. She spoke to Lucien in the rapid compressed shorthand of people who have worked together for a long time and have reduced their communication to the minimum necessary syllables. I understood perhaps half of it, enough to know that there was a problem with the organization, that someone at a level above Lucien had questions about his current situation, that the presence of a witness in his safe house was a complication that was creating concern. She looked at me directly and said, "You understand, you are a problem." I said, "I understand that I am being treated as one." She said to Lucien, "This is getting complicated." Lucien said, "I know." She said, "What is your plan?" He said, "I do not have one yet." She looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone who has seen this kind of thing before and knows where it goes. Not the captivity specifically. Something else, the specific expression of a person watching someone they know well in the early stages of something they cannot quite name but can recognize. She said very quietly, "Lucien." He did not answer. She stayed for 2 hours. Before she left, she came to where I was sitting and crouched down to my eye level and looked at me in a way that was not unfriendly exactly, but was absolutely assessing. She said, "Are you eating?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Are you sleeping?" I said, "Not well, but yes." She said, "Tell me if anything changes." I said, "Who would I tell? You are leaving." She reached into her jacket and put a small device on the table beside me. It was a communication device of some kind, a satellite communicator, smaller than a phone. She said, "This works inside the forest. Lucien knows how to reach me. If you need to use it, press and hold." I looked at the device, I looked at her. She was not. I understood giving me this as a means of escape or a way to call for help in the conventional sense. She was giving it to me because she was a person who, regardless of everything, operated according to some internal code that required her to not leave a young woman alone in a forest without any means of communication. She left. Lucian and I sat in the house in silence for a while. The satellite communicator sat on the table between us. He said eventually she is not a bad person. I said, what is she? He said she is a person who has been doing a difficult thing for a long time and has made her peace with it in ways that are not always admirable. She is also very good at her job and has kept me alive several times. I said, what did she say to you before she left? The part I could not hear. He was quiet. I said, she said something about me. He said she said I should be careful. I said, careful of what? He looked at the table. He said, of the situation becoming something it should not become. The words sat in the room with us for a long time. I went to bed that night and lay in the narrow bed in the stone room and listened to the forest, which has a specific sound at night that is not silence, but is the sound of things moving that are not human, the sound of a world that does not include you in its arrangements, and that will continue after you are gone. I thought about Sandrine's expression, the one she had when she looked at Lucian, the expression of recognition. I thought about what she had recognized. Part 6, the question of the sister. On a day in the 6th week, Lucian told me about his parents. He did not intend to. It emerged from something else, from a conversation that had begun as an argument about something trivial and had turned in the way that arguments between people who are confined together for extended periods sometimes turn into something larger and more honest. The argument had begun because I had asked him to explain the system of the bookshelves, how they were organized, and he had refused. And I had said it was absurd to refuse such a thing, and he had said that not everything required an explanation, and I had said that he used the absence of explanation as a way to maintain distance from everyone, including himself. And he had gone very still in the way he went still when something had landed accurately. He said, my parents are alive. I had not asked about his parents, but I understood the connection to what I had said, the distance he maintained from himself, and I said nothing and waited. He said they gave me up when I was 7, not formally. There was no formal arrangement. They simply left me at the group home in Lyon and did not come back for me. He said this with the economy he used for everything, the flat, efficient delivery of a fact. But there was something underneath the delivery, something that the economy was working to contain, and I had been watching Lucian for 6 weeks and knew the difference between his natural economy and his managed economy. He said, I have their address. I have had it for years. I chose not to contact them. They have a family, 3 other children, a house in Montpellier, an ordinary life. I said, why have you not contacted them? He said, because I do not know what I would say, and because I do not want to be the thing that disrupts whatever they have built, even if what they built was partly built on my absence. I said, you said Vivian is your sister. He said, she is a girl who was at the group home when I was. She has no family either. We decided we were family. This seemed more efficient than the alternative. I said the alternative being. He said having no family. I looked at him across the table. He was looking at the table surface, at his hands on the table surface, with the expression of someone who has said more than they intended and is doing the internal accounting of what this costs. I said, you want to find them, your parents. He said, that is not a useful want. I said, why not? He said, because I am not in a position to walk back into a family. The things I have done are not compatible with ordinary family life. I know this about myself. I said, what if you were no longer in this position? What if you finished the leaving you said you were doing? He said, that is a hypothetical. I said, it is a real question. He looked up from the table. He looked at me directly, which he sometimes did and sometimes did not. When he did, it was always with the full quality of his attention, and his full attention was one of the more disconcerting experiences I had had in the stone house. He said if I were no longer in this position, I would find them. I think I would find them. I do not know what I would do after finding them. I said, that is honest. He said, it is the best I can do. We sat with this for a while. Outside the high window, the forest did what the forest did in the late afternoon, beginning the rapid transition from gold to dark. He said, "What were your parents like?" I said, "Good, ordinary and good. They run a bakery. They have worried about me my entire life in the specific way of people who love you so completely that the loving sometimes feels like pressure." He said, "That sounds difficult." I said, "It sounds like love." He was quiet. I said, "Lucian, you know I have to find a way out of here eventually." He said, "I know." I said, "And you know that I cannot promise you what happens after." He said, "I know that too." We sat in the late afternoon light until it was gone. Part 7, What Changed. I want to tell you what changed between us, and I want to tell it honestly, which means telling it slowly and without the compression that makes it sound like something it was not. What changed was not a moment. It was an accumulation. 6 weeks of shared meals and shared silences and the specific intimacy of two people in a small stone house in a forest who have no option except to eventually know each other. The intimacy was not chosen. It was produced by the conditions. But what is produced by conditions can still be real. I began to know him in the way that you know the people you live with. The specific rhythm of him in the morning when he was quietest and required no conversation. The way he read with the whole of himself. The book held close and a specific quality of absent presence there in the room but entirely elsewhere. The way he handled things with a care that was at odds with his profession, setting down cups and tools and objects as though they had value. The way he stood at the window and looked at the forest in the evenings, with an expression I had no name for something that was not nostalgia, and was not longing but was in the family of both. He began to know me also. I could tell from the way the meals changed the food, adapting slowly to something he was observing about my preferences without asking. The way he would occasionally set a book on the table beside my place, something he had noticed me looking at on the shelf without comment. The way he read my silences differently from his own understanding, by some accumulation of observation when I was quiet, because I was thinking, and when I was quiet because I was frightened, and when I was quiet because I was angry. One evening he asked me about my work, not the job exactly, the design. He asked what it was that I found interesting about visual thinking, and I told him, and he listened with the full quality of his attention. And we talked for 2 hours about things that had nothing to do with the situation we were in, about how people receive information through image differently from through language, about the specific way that colour communicates below the level of conscious thought, about the designers whose work I found most honest. He asked questions that were the right questions, the questions of someone who is genuinely curious, rather than performing interest. Afterward, in the silence that followed, he said, "You are good at your work. The way you talk about it makes that clear." I said, "Thank you." He said, "I have never done anything I was good at that was also good." I sat with this for a long time. It was, I think, the most honest thing he had said to me. And I understood that it was honest, that it was not a performance of regret, designed to produce a response in me, but a fact he was stating in the specific flat way he stated facts. I said, "You could." He said, "I do not know what that looks like." I said, "Neither do I, but that is not a reason not to find out." He looked at me for a long time. Then he got up and went to bed. And I sat at the table in the stone house in the forest and thought about the distance between where a person starts and where they end up, and all the decisions in between that constitute the path. Part 8, Sandrine returns. Sandrine came back in the 3rd month, this time without the car. She arrived in the early morning on foot, from a direction that was not the way Lucian used to leave the forest, which told me there was at least one other path I had not found. She looked different from the first visit, not physically, the same controlled competence, the same efficient movement, but the specific quality of her attention was different, more urgent. The urgency of someone who has come to say something they have been deciding whether to say. She spoke to Lucian. I could hear the conversation from the other room without understanding most of it. I understood enough. Someone in the organization had become concerned about the duration of my presence in the house. The standard protocol for a witness in my position was not extended captivity. The standard protocol was something else. I heard my name twice. I heard Lucien's voice, which was normally very controlled, move in a direction that controlled voices move, when control is being applied to something that is not naturally controllable. I heard Sandrine say very clearly, Lucien, you have to make a decision. I heard him say something that I could not hear. She came into the room where I was. She sat down across from me with the directness she always brought. She said, you know what the organization wants. I said, I have guessed. She said, Lucien is resisting it. He has been resisting it since the beginning. I said, I know. She said, this is going to come to a point where the resistance is no longer possible. I said, what are you telling me? She looked at me for a moment. She said, I am telling you that I have a car at the edge of the forest, and that Lucien is going to be occupied for the next 20 minutes with a communication he needs to receive. I looked at her. She said, the path is west of the house. Follow the creek bed for 2 kilometers. The car will be there. Keys are under the left rear wheel. I said, why are you doing this? She said, because this situation has gone past the point where my code of conduct permits me to do nothing. She stood up. She went back to the other room. I sat for a moment. I thought about Lucien, who was in the other room receiving a communication that Sandrine had arranged for him to receive, who had spent 3 months being something that contradicted what he was supposed to be, who had cooked every meal and left books on my table, and listened to me talk about design and told me about his parents and the group home in Lyon. I got up, I put on my coat, which was hanging by the door. I went to the door and put my hand on the latch. I stopped. I went back to the table. I found paper. I wrote 3 sentences. I left the paper on the table where he would find it. Then I went out the door and found the creek bed and followed it west for 2 kilometers and found the car with the keys under the left rear wheel. I drove for an hour before I stopped crying. Then I drove for another 4 hours until I reached Paris and the 14th arrondissement and the apartment above the bakery, and my parents, who were both in the kitchen when I came through the door, and my mother made a sound I had never heard from her before, and my father did not speak for a long time. And eventually the 3 of us sat at the kitchen table, and the smell of bread was around us, and the specific, ordinary, impossible to value warmth of being in the presence of people who love you without complication. Part 9, the 3 sentences. I want to tell you what I wrote on the paper, not because you could not guess, but because the exact words matter and I have them. I wrote, I have to go. You know this and so do I. I hope you find your way to Montpellier. That was all. 3 sentences. I have thought about them many times since, whether they were the right 3 sentences, whether there were other sentences that would have been more honest or more complete or more kind. I have not found them. The 3rd sentence is the one I think about most. I hope you find your way to Montpellier, where his parents lived with their 3 children and their ordinary life, and the space that had been created by his absence from it. I do not know if he has found his way there. I do not know if he is alive. These are things I have had to learn to hold as unknowns. What I know is that the 3 months in the stone house in the Forêt de Mormours changed something in me that I have spent the 2 years since trying to understand correctly. Not the captivity itself, which was what it was, a situation I would not have chosen and would not wish on anyone, but the specific education of those 3 months. The things I learned about what a person can become when they have been given no reason to be anything other than what is useful. Lucien had been shaped entirely by utility. The organization had taken a 7-year-old boy with no one to protect him and had produced over 10 years an instrument. Instruments do not have preferences. They do not cook with attention or leave books on tables or feel things about the music one sister plays or want, with the wanting of a person who has never had the thing to be part of a family. These were not instrument behaviors. These were the behaviors of a person who had survived being made into an instrument and had retained underneath the making something that the making had not reached. I had seen that thing. and the seeing of it had produced in me a feeling that I am still 2 years later in the process of understanding. Part 10 After. Paris in November is grey in the specific way of a city that accepts grey as its natural condition and does not perform cheerfulness about it. The light is flat and honest and demands nothing decorative. I came back to my job at the agency in the Marais 3 weeks after I came home. I had told the police what I could, which was less than they wanted for reasons I could not fully articulate, without explaining the 3 months in a way that I was not ready to explain. I gave them the name Lucien Moreau, which Sandrine later told me was not his real name and therefore produced nothing. I gave them the location of the forest to the best of my ability, which was imprecise enough to be almost useless. The investigation continued for some months and was eventually suspended. Sandrine contacted me once 3 months after I came home, through a method I will not describe because I do not entirely understand it. She told me in 2 sentences that Lucien had left the organization, that he was no longer in France. She did not tell me where he was, and I did not ask. I went back to my work. The specific relief of returning to something that made sense to me, the visual language that I knew how to speak, was greater than I had anticipated. I had not understood until I was away from it how much of myself lived in the work. I threw myself into it with a focus that my colleagues interpreted as ambition, and that was actually something else. The specific gratitude of a person who has been reminded that the ordinary is not ordinary. My parents. Let me tell you about my parents because they are important and I have not said enough about them. My mother Cecile baked bread every morning of her adult life. She had been doing it since before I was born, at the same hours, in the same kitchen, with the same recipe that her own mother had taught her, modified over 30 years, by her own understanding of the dough and the oven and the specific quality of the flour she preferred. The bread she produced was not remarkable by any objective standard. It was good bread, honest bread, the bread that a neighborhood could depend on. She woke up every morning at 4:15, which is what the bread requires. She had never in 30 years slept past 4:15 on a workday, not because she was incapable of it, because the bread required her at 4:15, and she had decided decades ago that the bread was worth the sacrifice and had not revisited the decision. My father Marcel was the front of house half of the operation. He had the specific gift of the person who makes everyone who enters a space feel that the space was waiting for them. He knew the names of regulars and the preferences of occasional customers and the life circumstances of the neighborhood in a general caring way. He had, without intending to, become one of the informal social nodes of the 14th arrondissement. The person you told things to while you waited for your bread, because telling him things felt like telling someone who would hold them carefully. They had worried about me my entire life, not in a way that was intrusive or controlling, in the specifically French middle-class way of parents who have one child and have organized a significant portion of their emotional existence around that child's well-being. The worry was real and occasionally exhausting, and was at its root a very complete form of love. When I came home through the kitchen door after 3 months, my mother made the sound I mentioned, and my father stood up from his chair, and neither of them asked me anything for a long time. They simply put me between them and held on, and the kitchen smelled of bread, and the morning light was starting to come through the window, and I understood. In a way I had not understood before I had been taken from it, that this was the thing. This specific, irreplaceable, ordinary thing. Part 11, the letter. 8 months after I came home, a letter arrived at my parents' address. No return address. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. Inside was a single page. He wrote that he had found his way to Montpellier. He wrote that he had stood outside the house for an hour before knocking, and that when the door opened, the woman who answered had his eyes, or he had her eyes, which amounts to the same thing. He wrote that the conversation had been one of the hardest he had ever had, and that it had been necessary. He wrote that he was no longer in the profession. He wrote that he did not know what came next. He wrote that the 3 sentences I had left on the table were the most important thing anyone had ever said to him, because they were 3 sentences that did not pretend the situation was something other than what it was, and did not pretend that he was something other than what he was, and still pointed him towards something. He wrote at the end, "I hope Paris, in November, suits you. I remember you telling me that grey light is honest." He did not sign it with his name. He signed it with a single word, Lucien. Not the name that was not his name, just Lucien. Whatever that name meant to him, it was the name I knew him by, and he offered it without qualification. I read the letter 4 times. I folded it and put it in the drawer of my desk, at the apartment next to the book I had taken from his shelf, without meaning to a collection of essays on European landscape painting that had somehow ended up in my bag on the day I left. I did not write back, not because I had nothing to say, because I needed time to understand what I wanted to say, and I had learned in the stone house that rushing understanding produces the wrong answers. 6 months later, I wrote back. What I wrote I will not tell you here. It is mine and his, and it belongs to us. But I wrote it and I sent it and I waited. Part 12, What Ordinary Means. 2 years after the Tuesday in the Parc de la Gerente, I am sitting in my apartment in the 14th arrondissement, which is the same apartment I grew up near, and different from the apartment I grew up near in all the ways that 2 years of specific and transformative experience makes you different from the person who began them. I work at the same agency, I do the same work. From the outside, very little has changed. From the inside, the change is structural, the kind that alters not the surface of a thing, but the architecture beneath it, the load-bearing elements, the things that determine what the surface can support. I walk home through the Parc de la Gerente sometimes, not every evening, not alone at night. But sometimes in the late afternoon, I take the path through the middle of the park, and I walk the route I walked on the Tuesday in October 2 years ago, and I look at the iron lamps and the gravel path and the wall on the far side. I do not think about what I saw there every time, but I think about it sometimes. And what I think when I think about it is not what I expected to think. I think about how thin the membrane is between the life you are living and the life that the world can suddenly produce instead. How any ordinary Tuesday evening can become the pivot point around which everything else rearranges. I had been a person who believed with the specific arrogance of someone who has not yet been given reason not to believe it, that the dangerous things happen to other people on other Tuesday evenings in other parks. And then they happened to me, and the me who came out the other side was different from the me who went in. And the difference is not only loss, there is a man somewhere in Europe who is learning what comes next, after a long time of only knowing what was available before. I do not know where he is. I do not know if the Montpellier conversation has become anything, or if he has found any version of the family he wanted. I know that he left. I know that he is trying. These are the things I know. My mother makes bread every morning at 4:15. My father knows the names of the regulars. On Sundays, I go to the bakery for the first hour and work the counter while they take their coffee, and the neighborhood comes in for its bread, with its ordinary concerns and its ordinary lives. And I hand the bread across the counter with the specific attention of someone who has learned not to take the handing for granted. This is my life, the grey November light, the bread, the design work, and the studio, and the colleagues who do not know what I know about the thinness of the membrane, the drawer with the letter and the book of landscape essays, the letter I wrote and sent and have not yet received an answer to. Ordinary, more than I knew. Part 13, Sandrine. I want to tell you about Sandrine before I finish. She contacted me once more 18 months after the first contact, through the same method I do not understand. She told me that she had also left the organization, that she was in the South Provence, somewhere running something legitimate, that she described with a dry economy that suggested it was going well, and that she found the legitimacy slightly absurd, and was adjusting. She asked if I was all right. I said, yes, are you? She said, getting there. She said he is in Lisbon. I did not ask her to tell me this, but she told me, and the telling of it was a gift specific and unnecessary and freely given, which is the best kind of gift. Lisbon, a city on the Atlantic coast with a particular quality of light that falls differently from Paris, light, warmer and more directional, more inclined toward the kind of afternoon that makes people sit in squares and not rush. I thought about him in Lisbon. I thought about what he was doing there, whether it was the starting of something or the continuation of the leaving, whether he had found work that was good at and also good, whether he had sat in a square in the afternoon light and felt something that he did not have a name for, but that the body knows. I sent my letter to a Lisbon address. I do not know if it found him. I am waiting. Waiting, I have learned, is not the same as doing nothing. It is the specific activity of a person who has prepared and has sent what they have prepared into the world and is now in the phase of the thing that belongs to someone else. You do your part and then you wait. And the waiting is its own form of trust, the trust that what you sent was worth sending and that the answer, whatever it is, will be what the situation requires. I wait. The grey November light comes through the window of my apartment. The bread smell comes up from below. This is my life. It is enough. Epilogue, the Parc de la Jarente. On the 2-year anniversary of the Tuesday in October, I go to the park. It is evening but not late. The light is still enough to see by. The iron lamps are on. The gravel path curves through the middle of the park in its familiar arc. The wall on the far side is exactly as it always was. I walk the path slowly. I am not afraid. I am paying attention, which is a different thing. The difference between fear and attention is that fear closes the world down and attention opens it up. I spent 3 months learning the difference in a stone house in a forest. At the far end of the park near the wall, I stop. I look at the ground. There is nothing to see. The world has been rearranged many times since that Tuesday evening, and the ground holds no record of the rearrangement, or none that is visible to the eye. I take out my phone. There is a message from a number I do not have saved. It is 2 sentences. The letter arrived. Can I come to Paris? I stand in the park in the November light and read the message twice. Then I write back, yes. I put my phone in my pocket and walk home through the park. On the gravel path, past the iron lamps, toward the apartment above the bakery, toward the bread smell and the grey light and everything ordinary and irreplaceable. The forest is somewhere north of here. The stone house is in it. Both are real. Both belong to the history that made me who I am standing in this park, which is not the person who walked through it 2 years ago, which is the only accurate thing I can say about what I have become. I walk home. The lamps make their yellow circles on the gravel. The city goes on around me in its ordinary evening. I am exactly where I am. That is everything. And When the Captor Loves the Captive is an original dramatic narrative set in Paris and a forest in rural France. All characters, events, and institutions depicted herein are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to actual persons living or dead, or to actual organizations or events, is entirely coincidental. Additional chapter, The Bookshelves. He told me the bookshelf system on the last day. I do not know if he knew it was the last day. I did not know it was the last day. But looking back, the specific quality of the morning had a finality that I understand now in retrospect. He said, "You have been looking at the shelves for 3 months. I said, "You arranged them in a system I cannot decode." He said, "I know, I did it deliberately." I said, "Of course you did." He said, "The books are arranged by what they taught me, not by subject or author, by the thing I took from them that changed something in how I understood the world." I looked at the shelves, 2 long shelves, perhaps 200 books. I said, "Show me." He stood up. He went to the shelf. He pointed to a section on the left. He said, "These are the books that taught me that the world is not divided into the people who do harm and the people who receive it, that the categories bleed." that most people occupy both positions at various points in their lives. He moved along the shelf. He said, "These are the books that taught me how to be alone, not to endure aloneness, to actually be good at it, to find the specific texture of it, to understand what it gives you as well as what it costs." He moved again. He said, "These ones I do not entirely understand yet. I keep them because I think I am not ready for them yet. I reread the first pages sometimes to check." I said, "And these ones here?" He said, "Those are yours." I said, "Mine." He said, "I have been putting them there as I identified them. Books I thought you would like or that I thought you should read. I was going to give them to you eventually." I stood in front of the small section he had designated mine and read the spines. He was right. He had been paying attention to me with the same accuracy he paid to everything. I said, "You were going to give them to me eventually." He said, "Yes." I said, "When?" He said very quietly, when I figured out what came next. We stood at the bookshelf in the stone house in the forest, and I took down one of the books he had chosen for me, the collection of essays on European landscape painting, and I held it in both hands. I said, "Can I take this one?" He said, "Take them all." I took the one, I put it in my jacket pocket, then I turned around and we looked at each other for a moment in the morning light. Whatever was said in that moment was not said in words. I am not going to invent the words for it, because the words were not the point. The point was the looking and what the looking contained, which was the full and complicated truth of 3 months of a situation that should not have produced what it produced, and did. Then the morning continued and Sandrine arrived and I left. I have the book. It is on my desk. I have read it twice. The essays are about how European painters learned to look at landscape, how they learned to see it as something that contained meaning rather than simply background, how the act of sustained attention to an external world produces eventually an understanding of something interior. I think about this sometimes. The sustained attention, what it produces. Additional chapter, the answer. He came to Paris in December. I had said yes when he asked. I had meant the yes completely, which is a different thing from saying yes without being sure. When you mean it completely, there is no condition attached to it. There is simply the yes and what the yes opens. He arrived on a Thursday evening. I had given him the address of the bakery, not my apartment. I had done this because the bakery was the place I was most myself, the place where the history of who I was resided in the smell and the light and my parents behind the counter. I wanted him to see that first. He came through the door at 6 o'clock. The bakery was still open, winding down, the last of the day's bread nearly gone. My father was behind the counter. My mother was in the back. My father looked up when the door opened and said good evening, and looked at the man who came in, and then at me, and his face did the thing it does when he is reading a situation. Lucien stood inside the door for a moment. He looked at the bakery, at the remaining bread, at the warmth that the ovens had left in the space at my father behind the counter. He had the expression I had seen on him in the stone house when something contradicted what he had expected. I said, "Papa, this is Lucien." "Ah, go, Lucien." My father looked at him for a moment. He said, "You are hungry. Sit down." It was not a question. My father has been feeding people for 30 years, and he recognizes hunger that is not only physical. Lucien sat down at the small table by the window that we kept for the regulars who wanted to eat their bread on the premises. My father put bread and butter and a bowl of soup in front of him. My mother came out from the back and looked at Lucien and then at me and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. I sat across from Lucien. He ate the bread and the soup. He did not speak for a while. Then he said, "Your father's bread is exceptional." I said, "He has been making it for 30 years. He said, "It tastes like it, like something that has been refined by that much time and attention." My father, who had excellent hearing and was ostensibly restocking a shelf nearby, said without turning around, "My daughter designed the packaging. She is exceptional at her work." Lucien looked at me. He said, "I know." My father turned around. He looked at Lucien with the specific attention of a man who has spent 30 years learning to read people across a counter. He said, "You are going to stay for dinner." It was not a question either. Lucien stayed for dinner. My mother made something with chicken and herbs that filled the kitchen with a smell I had grown up inside of, and that landed differently that evening, more specifically, more consciously. We sat at the table, the four of us, and talked about things that were not the situation we were in. About Lisbon, where Lucien had spent the previous months, which my mother asked about with the specific, warm curiosity she extended to everywhere she had not been. About Bordeaux and Vivian and the wine she worked with. About the 14th arrondissement and the changes the neighbourhood had been through, and whether the Saturday market would move, which was a subject my father had opinions about. It was considered as an event, simply a dinner. The kind that happens in kitchens everywhere every evening. Considered as what it actually was, it was extraordinary. A man who had spent 17 years in a profession that requires the complete absence of ordinary life, sitting at an ordinary table in the ordinary light of an ordinary kitchen in Paris, eating chicken with herbs. I watched his face through the dinner, the specific quality of his attention to my parents, which was the full quality, the kind he gave to everything. The way he listened to my father's opinions about the Saturday market, with the focused interest of someone encountering a world they have not had access to. The way he answered my mother's questions about Lisbon, with more words than he usually used, as though the warmth of the asking had loosened something. After dinner, when my parents had gone to bed, he and I sat in the kitchen with the last of the wine. The bakery was quiet below. The 14th arrondissement was doing its late evening things outside the window. He said, "Your family is what I imagined family was, when I was old enough to understand what I had missed." I said, "They are ordinary people who love each other very much." He said, "Yes, that is what I mean." I said, "Lucien, what happens now?" He said, "I do not know exactly. I am learning a different way to live. I am not good at it yet." I said, "You were not good at the forest jam either the first time. It got better." He looked at me, the expression underneath the management, the person. He said, "I found a job in Lisbon before I came here. Legitimate. Security consulting for an architectural firm. It is not interesting, but it is good." I said, "Good covers a lot of ground." He said, "Yes, I think that is the point." We sat in the kitchen for a long time. The bread smell, the grey Paris light doing its honest work through the window. Eventually he said, "Can I ask you something?" I said, "Yes." He said, "The 3 sentences you left on the table. I hope you find your way to Montpellier." Why that specifically? Why not something else? I thought about this. I said, "Because the thing you wanted most was the thing you were furthest from. And because I thought if you could get to Montpellier, you could get to anything else from there. It was the first step, not the whole journey." He said it was. I said, "Did you go?" He said yes. I said, "And?" He said it was hard. It is still hard. They are people who made choices they cannot undo, and who have spent years not knowing what happened to me, and who now have to reckon with what happened to me and with what I became. It is not a clean story." I said, "Most true stories are not." He said, "No, but they are trying, and I am trying." And Vivian came for one of the dinners, which helped. I thought about Vivian, who had never known the details, but had known the category, who had loved him across the distance of not knowing, and had kept the letters coming twice a year. I said, "She is good, your sister." He said, "She is the best person I know, present company included, before you say anything." I said I was not going to say anything. He looked at me. He said with the small economy of someone who means every word and wastes none, "You are the second best person I know, for what it is worth. The kitchen, the bread smell, the window." I said, "It is worth a great deal." We sat in the ordinary light of an ordinary kitchen in Paris, and the city went on around us. And the answer that had been travelling from Lisbon was here in this room, sitting across the table. That is where this story ends. Not because everything is resolved, not because the path is clear, or the complications have been managed, or the history has been made simpler, but because the story arrives at this table, in this light, with this answer, and the rest of it belongs to the living of it, which is not yet done. I am in the living of it. That is enough.